Good afternoon and welcome to HP2, the sequel is always worse. Have you ever seen something that was so complex it had to be hackable if only you had time to understand it? HP2 is a beautiful beast, but it is complex, and where there's complexity people take shortcuts and things go wrong. In this session I'm going to show you how you can use new features in H2 for a range of high impact attacks, and also how these shed light on a type of request smuggling that has always existed but nobody ever really noticed. Complexity causes trouble for me too. I first looked at the H2 spec way back in 2019 when I was doing the research for HTTP desync attacks, and I loaded up the spec, I looked at the size of the browser scroll bar, and then I proceeded to skim read it so fast that I didn't even read the security considerations. My next encounter with H2 was after I delivered that presentation in 2019. An audience member asked me, did those techniques work on H2? And my answer was no, it was completely secure against these types of attacks. And that was that until my third encounter, which was that same day at a party in Vegas after a few drinks. Someone asked me the same question and I gave them the same answer, and then they proceeded to explain to me exactly how you could exploit systems using request smuggling over HTTP2. This next bit is tricky to explain without coming off badly, but at this point in time, I'd just been handed an amazing lead, yes, but on the other hand, I'd just spent 9 months exploiting request smuggling. So the prospect of doing more request smuggling exploitation didn't exactly fill me with joy, and I just went off and spent a year researching cache poisoning instead. When I came back 1 year later, I tried this idea out and found, it really worked. I could hack loads of interesting systems in exciting new ways, and there was just one fly in the ointment, and that was Bitbucket. Every heuristic that I tried said that Bitbucket should be vulnerable, but every actual exploit I tried reliably failed. And normally when I encounter something like this during research, I would spend a bit of time on it and then just give up and move on. But I'd already encountered a scenario much like this during my original HTTP desync attacks research, and I was determined not to let it escape me a second time. So I did continue with exploiting other sites and refining the techniques, and I also kept coming back to Bitbucket, repeatedly trying to crack it and getting nowhere until January, when thanks to an incredibly lucky accident, I got iron proof that this system was really vulnerable to request smuggling. However, I still couldn't actually exploit it, and after spending a bunch more time on it, I just gave up and told Atlassian, hey there, you've got this suspicious behaviour on your site. Technically it's vulnerable, but practically I think this is probably harmless. You might want to patch it, you might not, it's up to you. Aside from that though, everything was going really well with this research. Until around March, when Emil published a bunch of research that he'd been doing at the same time as me on the same topic. This meant that my presentation would lack anything truly groundbreaking because it was all in his presentation, which was published beforehand, unless I could find something entirely new. And so naturally, I went back to Bitbucket, and this time I finally cracked it. And this led to a sequence of events. I found a new, more powerful type of desynchronization attack. An entire class of issue that was previously basically useless became practically exploitable. Atlassian had to log everybody out of Jira worldwide, and got the computer emergency response team involved and awarded me with triple their maximum bounty. So, out of that mess, I've managed to extract some information that I hope you'll find really quite useful, regardless of whether you've seen Emil's presentation already or not. I'm not going to tackle this topic in chronological order because it doesn't make sense, even to me looking at it in retrospect. Instead, first I'm going to show how you can use HTTP2 for request smuggling. Then I'll focus on request tunneling and show practical techniques to confirm and exploit it. Then I'll take a look at 5 new HP2 Exploit Primitives, and then cover some miscellaneous odds and ends and how to defend against these attacks, and then take 5 minutes of questions. Also, if you're watching this live, you may be able to ask questions using a chat box on the right. If not, just tag me on Twitter and I'll answer there instead. So, although HTTP2 is complex, there's only actually 4 key things that you need to understand in order to effectively wield it as a weapon. Here, you can see an identical request represented in HTTP1 and HTTP2. The first key difference is pretty obvious. It's that where H1 has the request line containing the method and the path, H2 has done away with this concept and they've replaced it with pseudo headers. These look like headers, but they start with a colon, and they convey the information in the request line, and also there's the colon authority header, which replaces the host header. The second key difference is that HTTP1 is a plain text protocol, so that means that server parsing of requests is done using string operations. For example, servers have to look for new lines to know when one header ends and the next header starts. On the other hand, HTTP2 is a binary protocol, mostly using key value pairs. So what I'm showing you on these slides, whenever I represent a HTTP2 request, is an abstraction. It's not the actual bytes on the wire, and specifically the pseudo headers like colon method aren't headers that are literally called colon method. They actually map to a number like the byte 1. This approach of having a binary protocol with no string parsing involved, of course, means there's a lot less potential for ambiguity in HTTP2 messages. The third key difference is that in order to specify the length of the message, HTTP1 is relying on the content length header or the transfer encoding chunked header. HTTP2, meanwhile, has this built-in frame length concept that makes those headers redundant, and once again means it's not really possible to send a HTTP2 message that is ambiguous about its length. And that's the reason that I thought that request smuggling against HTTP2 wasn't possible. The final key difference is to do with the way that the two protocols handle multiple requests being sent over a single connection. With HTTP1, it's super simple. You send your request down your socket, you read the response back, and you just stick another request straight down that same socket. So this is exactly what it looks like on the wire, and you just read back the response in the same way. So you're reliant on the responses coming back in the order that you sent the requests. In HTTP2, they've replaced this concept with the concept of streams. A stream is simply a request-response pair. And every frame, which is the underlying HTTP2 data type that we mostly don't care about, has a stream ID, and that's how the browser knows which responses should be associated with which requests. And yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all you need to know to do all the exploits coming up. So, now that we understand HTTP2, let's see what damage we can do. As usual in this section, I've only targeted real systems with bug bounty programs. All of these findings were detected with an automated open source tool that I'll be releasing at the end of this presentation. And of any bounties earned, half have been donated to local charities and the other half has been spent on beer. If at any point you find the covering of exploitation in this section is going too fast and you haven't already seen my HTTP desync attacks presentation, you might want to pause it and check out that, because it covers similar exploitation techniques at a much more sedate pace. So, why is HTTP2 request smuggling possible? Well, it's because the vast majority of servers that speak HTTP2 actually speak HTTP1 to the backend. They speak H2 with the client and H1 with the backend. They're rewriting requests on their way in. And I'm going to refer to this behavior as HTTP2 downgrading. This setup is ridiculously common. For example, in Amazon's application load balancer, you literally can't disable this. If you turn on HTTP2, yes, it will speak HTTP2 with the client, but there's no way to make it speak HTTP2 to the backend system. You're going to land up in this configuration, which effectively dodges all the security benefits that HP2 is supposed to bring you. In fact, it kind of makes things worse, because HP1 based request smuggling occurs when the front end and the back end disagree about whether to use the content length or the transfer encoding chunked header to determine the length of a message. Meanwhile, if you turn on HP2 on the front end but do downgrading, well, the two systems can't agree because they don't have access to the same data. The front end is guaranteed to use the built-in HP2 message length, and then the backend doesn't have access to that message length because it's not speaking HP2, and it's forced to use the content length or the transfer encoding chunked header. If this sounds like a mess, that's because it is. Effectively, if you take your front end and you turn on HP2 support, you've just doubled the number of ways that you may be vulnerable to request smuggling. Congrats. So let's begin with an extremely simple case study. The HP2 RFC says that you're allowed to send a content length header over HP2 even though it's not required and is almost pointless. They say you're allowed to send it provided that it's correct. So what could possibly go wrong with this? Well, Netflix used the Netty Java library and they forgot to verify that the content length was correct. So if I sent a HP2 request like this, then when downgraded, it would look like this, and the data shown in orange would be prepended to the start of the next request coming from someone else to hit the back end, and would thereby redirect them to my server. I could just run this in a loop in real time and effectively redirect everyone browsing their site and potentially hijack script imports, thereby getting persistent control over their account and being able to do stuff like maybe steal plain text passwords and credit card numbers. For this, I got a $20,000 bounty off Netflix, and a patch has been applied to upstream Netty. After that motivating start, let's move on to something slightly more complex. The HP2 RFC says any message containing connection-specific header fields must be treated as malformed, but it's kind of vague about what happens if you don't do this, so I'm going to fill in the blanks. Quite a few servers don't do this. One such server is Amazon's application load balancer. It's now been patched, but at the time you could exploit tons of servers like this, and one such server was Oath's law enforcement portal. Here I've sent a request using transfer encoding chunked, which is a connection-specific header field that should lead to the message being rejected, and it's just been forwarded onto the backend. So the backend has prioritized the chunked encoding over the correct content length, and once again I've gained the ability to redirect arbitrary live users to my website. What I found was that I kept redirecting people who were in the middle of OAuth login flows, and thereby they ended up leaking their OAuth authentication codes to me via the referrer header. As well as affecting everything behind Amazon's application load balancer, this also affected everything behind Encapsula's web application firewall, which is ironically meant to make your website more secure. I reported this and got a $7,000 bounty off Oath for it. Notably, I reported this to both Amazon and Encapsula and didn't get a bounty off either. The people that write the vulnerable code are not necessarily the people who have to take responsibility for the result. On another target, also using Amazon's application load balancer, I found the same exploit technique worked, but when I triggered redirects, I got an even more interesting request landing on my server. It said, "Hello there, I'd like to have permission to send you my credentials." So I reconfigured my server so it said, "Yeah, absolutely, sure, send me your credentials," and sure enough, they did. I have a fantastic video from TCP dump showing credentials streaming onto my server in real time, but unfortunately it was nearly impossible to redact, so I gave up and I can't share it. There's an interesting side point here, which is if this website had been using cookies for authentication, this exploit would not have worked because the browser wouldn't have sent the cookies for one host to a different host. That's not to say cookies are better for authentication. They're terrible, just in different ways. For that, I got a $10,000 bounty, taking the total to 37k. So that was the basic stuff. Now things are going to get a bit more interesting. One cool thing about HP2 is that because it's a binary protocol, it lets you put arbitrary characters wherever you like. And it relies on an extra layer of server logic saying things like, nope, you shouldn't be putting new lines in headers. Firefox's start page was powered by the Netlify CDN, and they forgot to enforce this requirement. So as shown here, this led to a request header injection vulnerability, which I could use to inject a transfer encoding chunked header and trigger request smuggling and serve up content from other sites on the Netlify CDN, such as one that I control. And they had a cache, so that effectively let me do cache poisoning and take persistent control over every page of every site on the Netlify CDN. For this, I got 2k off Netlify and 2k off Mozilla. When I tried the same technique on Atlassian Jira, something really quite interesting happened. I expected to see two responses coming back, a normal one and a poisoned one. But I actually got a huge range of responses, clearly coming from different Jira deployments intended for different people and containing a huge amount of sensitive information. As you can see here, although hopefully I redacted all the properly sensitive stuff. This left me wondering what exactly had happened. I did not expect that, and eventually I was able to figure it out, and the problem was I'd realised that using this new lines in headers technique, I could place my malicious prefix inside the value of the foo header and thereby avoid the need for a body or using transfer encoding chunked or even needing to use the post method. So I smuggled a request that looks like this, and I thought I was doing the normal technique of sending 1.5 requests to the back end, thereby poisoning the next request to hit the endpoint. But I'd failed to account for the fact that the front end, because it viewed this injection as happening in the headers, it was just going to terminate the headers normally. So when they put their extra 2 blank lines on the end, as per the RFC spec, the end result was I smuggled exactly 2 requests to the back end. So I got the response to the first request, and the second response just kind of sat there on the back end waiting until someone else sent a request to the server. Then they got the response intended for me. And what about the response intended for them? Well, that sat on the server and waited for the next person, and so on. Basically, Jira lost track of which responses should be going to which people and ended up serving incorrect responses, not just to me, but to everybody. Everyone was getting random responses intended for other people. And thanks to the set cookie header, some of those would be persistently logging random users into random accounts, which is why after doing some hotfixes, Atlassian expired every Jira session worldwide, logging everybody out. The root cause of this vulnerability was the Pulse Secure Virtual Traffic Manager front end, which should not be confused with Pulse Secure's VPN. We also saw this technique worked on Netlify, and as usual, it worked on Imperva's WAF as well. While waiting for the Pulse Secure proper fix, Atlassian tried out a few hotfixes, and a couple of things went wrong here. So the first issue was they filtered new lines in header names, but not in header values, but not in header names. And direct exploitation of that didn't work because it results in an invalid request, as you can see. But you can put colons in header names in HP2, and using that, you could get the exploit once again working. Another issue was that they filtered header names and header values, but failed to filter pseudo headers, so you could inject new lines in the request line. So here I've put the entire payload in the method. When you're doing this, just think about what the resulting request is going to look like when it gets downgraded, or otherwise you'll end up with an invalid request and the attack will fail. And finally, this is a classic one, in the path, they only blocked the /r/n sequence. They didn't block /n by itself, and typically /n is all you need for a successful exploit. So in summary, in this section we've seen a whole range of techniques that you can use to exploit HP2 downgrades and achieve request smuggling. Now I'm going to take a look at something less flashy, less obvious, but still really quite dangerous. And in case you're wondering, yep, this is the vulnerability that I found on Bitbucket. When you find a request smuggling vulnerability, the possible attacks, your options, are affected by how the front end reuses the connection with the back end. In a typical scenario, they just reuse connections more or less randomly, and there's no real restrictions on your attacks, but sometimes they will only reuse a given connection for requests coming from the same client IP. Or even worse, only for requests coming over the same client connection, which makes exploitation of other users directly very difficult. But the worst case of all, the most challenging one, is when they just don't ever reuse connections to the back end. This creates a range of different problems and challenges, and this is the scenario that we had on Bitbucket and that I'm going to be exploring in detail today. In particular, I'm going to show you how to prove this vulnerability even exists and share some new exploit parts for it. So let's visualize what's happening here. As usual, the orange data is being treated as a separate request by the backend. But because this socket is being discarded by the front end after what it thinks is one request has been sent down it, any follow-up requests, regardless of whether they're coming from the attacker or from a potential victim, are going down a different socket and are being completely unaffected. This configuration happens naturally in the wild, and it's also deliberately triggered by Amazon's HTTP desync guardian as a way of, when it sees suspicious request, as a way of mitigating any harm that might be done. It's worth noting that their desync guardian didn't have any effect on any of the HP2 attacks shown earlier. So this behaviour causes a bunch of practical problems. Let's have a look at what they are and how to deal with them. The first problem is that although the classic timeout-based request smuggling detection technique works, even in this scenario, the normal confirmation technique will always fail. So it's easy to mistake this vulnerability for a false positive caused by timeouts. You might think it's quite easy to recognise this scenario, just smuggle a request like so and see if you get 2 responses, as you can see here. But unfortunately, this response doesn't show that this target is actually vulnerable, because this is how HTTP 1.1 is supposed to work. Unless we're able to answer the question, does the front end think it's sending us 1 response or 2, this doesn't tell us whether they're vulnerable or not. HP2, however, answers this question extremely cleanly for us, because if you see HTTP 1.1 headers and a HTTP 1.1 response nested inside the body of a HTTP2 response, well, yeah, that proves that they are, in fact, definitely vulnerable. The second problem is that request tunneling vulnerabilities like this are often blind, because the front end will look at the content length coming back from the response and only read that many bytes. So we have a common scenario where we can smuggle a second request. We can trigger 2 responses from the back end, but the second response is never read in by the front end and it's never passed on to us as the attacker. And this makes detection and exploitation extremely difficult. And this behaviour was present on Bitbucket. Fortunately for me, I had an extremely fluky breakthrough here. The response that I happened to be testing on Bitbucket was some binary file download, and it was huge. It was so huge that it made Burp's UI lag every time it loaded in the repeater. And aside from trying to get the team to fix the performance issues in Burp, I thought, you know what, I don't even care about the size of this response. I don't care about the body at all. All I'm really looking at is the response headers. So instead of using a post, why don't I just use a head and only ask for the response headers? So I sent a head, and what I got back included a nested second HTTP1 response. That's because when you send a head, it makes the backend send a response that has no body, but it may still contain a content length. So it may still trigger the front end to try and read some extra bytes off the socket, and effectively you can use head to make request tunneling vulnerabilities non-blind, maybe 50% of the time. So let's say you've confirmed your tunneling, hopefully made it non-blind. How do you exploit it? Well, you can't directly attack other users, so you've got two main options. You can bypass front-end security rules like attempts to block you from certain paths and stuff, which is straightforward and boring, or you can try and tunnel internal headers. Often front-end servers put on internal headers that say things like who the user is authenticated as, and these are implicitly trusted by the backend. But there's a catch with exploiting internal headers, which is that to exploit one, you need to know what they are. You need to know what internal headers the front end is putting onto the request in the first place. And with request tunneling, it's impossible to use normal known techniques to directly discover them. But if you can inject new lines into header values or header names or anywhere in the headers really, you can trigger a different new kind of desynchronization. Instead of causing a disagreement about where the body ends between the front end and the back end, you can cause a disagreement about where the body starts. If effectively you're doing a desynchronization in the headers directly rather than the bodies. And that leads to us being able to do what I'm showing here, where I'm sending what the front end and the back end both regard as one request. But the back end thinks the body starts where it says s equals Kettle, and thereby they think I'm searching for the values of the internal headers that the front end put on, and they will helpfully reflect them back to me, leaking them so I can try to exploit them. I also found different paths on Bitbucket would get routed to different backends with different internal headers, including some that had some secret keys in the headers, which was pretty cool. If you want to see a full exploitation work through using internal headers, check out my New Relic case study from the HTTP desync attacks presentation. So, there's one last possibility when the scenario is right. Sometimes if you've got requests, if you've got request tunneling and you can inject and you can cause a header-based desync, and they're using a cache, and the head technique works, then you can do cache poisoning. Cache poisoning is already one of the highest severity attacks possible with request smuggling, and the head technique enables a unique and extra powerful variety whereby you can effectively mix and match response headers and response bodies. So here I've smuggled a head and thereby triggered the headers from a normal 404 page with a content type of text HTML. And then thanks to their head overread behavior, I've used a nested get to trigger a different response that reflects my input unencoded in the location header. Normally that location header behavior is completely safe. There's nothing wrong with that really. But by combining these two responses, I've got arbitrary JavaScript execution, and because it's cache poisoning, that gives me full control over every page on the site. For this exploit, plus the stuff on Atlassian Jira seen earlier, I got 15k, triple their max bounty, taking the total earned during this research to 56k. Now I'm going to take you on a tour of HP2 Exploit Primitives. Each of these uses a H2 feature to get some kind of foothold on the target, and they're all based on real behaviors observed on real systems. In H1, duplicate headers cause all kinds of issues, but there's no way to specify a duplicate path or a duplicate method. But thanks to the design of pseudo headers, sometimes on some servers you can, and servers do treat requests with multiple paths inconsistently. So there's definitely going to be some interesting exploits coming up using that technique. Also, in HP2, they've introduced the authority pseudo header, which kind of replaces the host, but both of them are allowed, and I believe both of them are optional. So this creates ample ways that you can have ambiguity about your request and ensures that host header attacks will live on. They also introduce the :scheme pseudo header, and this is pretty much a novel attack surface, and as such a whole bunch of people do no validation on this value. It's supposed to just be HTTP or HTTPS, but a bunch of targets use it to build URLs. It's worth mentioning both the techniques here work on targets even if they aren't doing HP2 downgrading. Even if they're speaking HP2 end-to-end, this one's still worth a shot. First of all, on Netlify you could put a full URL in the scheme and thereby confuse them about what was the host, what's the path, and so on. And on a different target, they were using it to construct a URL that they would then send the request to. So you can make them try to send the request to the wrong destination just using the scheme. Another cool thing you can do in HTTP1 that sometimes leads to request smuggling is just using a colon. Sometimes you'll find you can put a colon in a header name, but you can't use new lines. And you'll only occasionally get request smuggling with this because the server is going to put this annoying extra colon on the end that's supposed to signal the start of the value. This behavior is often going to be more suited to host header attacks where servers expect a colon in the value and they often ignore everything after the colon. That said, I did use this to get request smuggling on one target, and I got halfway through exploitation and then the vulnerability disappeared somewhat annoyingly, and the server banner reported that they'd updated their installation of Apache. So I went looking for an advisory in Apache security releases and I couldn't find anything. So I thought, okay, I'll install the vulnerable version of Apache locally. I'll get an advisory issued, even though technically there's already a patch available, might as well, and maybe I'll use it for a demo. So I installed it locally and I couldn't replicate the vulnerability. I still don't know why. Maybe it's vulnerable, maybe it isn't, but what I did do was find a different vulnerability in Apache. What I found was when mod proxy is used for HP2 downgrading, they let you put a space or as many spaces as you like in the request method. So that triggers a request line injection vulnerability. On some servers, the fact that you'll end up with trailing junk in the request line will make this useless, but on a bunch of them, everything after the HTTP 1.1, the first HTTP 1.1, will be ignored, and you'll be able to exploit this to do things like bypass attempts to block access to certain folders and also to escape from certain folders on the back end that they're trying to trap you inside. At the time of this being recorded, there's no patch available for this, but I'm cautiously optimistic that one will be available by the time that you're watching this. Finally, a few practicalities. HTTP2 and HTTP1 are spoken over the same port. So, in order for a client like a browser to know which protocol to speak, it's reliant on the server advertising the fact that it supports HTTP2 during the SSL handshake. And some servers do support HTTP2, but they forget to advertise this, which means no clients will speak HTTP2 with them by default. This can lead to you missing some extremely valuable and juicy attack surface. But fortunately, it's extremely easy to detect this in a number of ways and take advantage of it. I even found a real example where they had this behavior and the HP2 setup was exploitable, but somewhat amusingly, it only let me exploit other people using HTTP2, which was nobody, so it was useless. Another potential pitfall is that although HTTP2 is supposed to be great about separating requests into streams and so on, sometimes a stream will break all subsequent streams on that connection, And other times, the first stream on any connection will be treated subtly differently by the front end. So there are approaches you can use to manage this behavior, but it's also something that seems quite interesting as a target for further research, so I'll be looking into this shortly. Finally, the tooling situation, like everything else, is a bit of a mess. Because it's a binary protocol, you can't use things like Netcat and OpenSSL for HP2 testing. And because we're sending malformed requests, you can't use normal libraries like libcurl because they will refuse to send these HP2 requests. So what are your options? Well, there's a HP2 stack built into Burp Suite, which was designed with this stuff in mind and supports it all. There's also the HP2 stack that I coded from scratch, and it's open source in Turbo Intruder, which is extremely powerful. You can code it, you can make tweaks to it easily. It's not the most reliable in the world, but it does mostly work. And there's also Emil's tool HP2 Smuggle, which was made by hacking up the Go HP2 stack, and may be more reliable, so that might be worth a shot too. As far as detection goes, I'm releasing a major update to the HP Request Smuggler Burp extension, which will support all the techniques found in this presentation. So, defense. Well, first and foremost, please just avoid HTTP2 downgrading. Just speak HTTP2 end to end. If you do that, about 80% of the attacks from this presentation simply won't work. Also, if you're implementing a server, please make sure you don't let people do things like put new lines in headers or put colons in header names and so on. Just pretend it's HTTP1 and do that level of strict validation. And finally, if you're a developer, assume that none of that was done and that headers may have new lines in them. And that means that things that it used to be safe to do, like taking a HTTP header and putting it in an SMTP header, could lead to SMTP injection and critical vulnerabilities such as unauthenticated takeover of WordPress accounts with no user interaction. And also, finally, don't trust the scheme pseudo header. Please just look at the actual scheme that they're using. There's a whole bunch of further reading available. The main thing I'd like to draw your attention to is that we're releasing online interactive labs. These will have either just launched or be launching very soon, and will let you try out techniques from this presentation for yourself in a safe and legal environment. And the three key things to take away are that HTTP2 breaks assumptions at multiple layers, HTTP2 downgrades are extremely hazardous, and request tunneling is a real threat. I'm going to take 5 minutes of questions now. If you have any more after that, feel free to just chuck me an email. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter. Thank you for listening.